Tonight's deep dive takes you inside Fairmont Crest at the exact moment Leslie and Ted think the night is finally safe, right before a buried secret lights up the room and turns routine into ruin. We'll rewind through the quiet compromises that brought them here, follow the digital breadcrumb that exposes everything, and track how Mona and Jan transform long-stored anger into a public reckoning that rips through alliances and reputations. This breakdown maps the timeline, unpacks the power plays, and projects the darkest, most plausible fallout: careers on ice, finances ring-fenced, friendships weaponized, and a home recast as an exhibit of betrayal. Stay to the end for the negative trajectory forecast: who loses leverage first, who gets scapegoated next, and why the aftermath may leave Leslie condensed rather than defeated while Ted faces a slow, unsparing unseating. Buckle up, this is the night Fairmont Crest stops pretending. As the night closed with a thin mist clinging to the bedroom window frame, Leslie believed she had finally reclaimed a steady breath after a day battered by insinuations, prying glances, and half-true, half-teasing compliments swirling around Ted. She had told herself that peace was a choice, that if she locked her heart and refused to interrogate the shadows, everything would drift by like a passing cloud, but dignity would not lie down, and the past refused to be gagged. Ted, resourceful by nature, fond of control, always trying on a grin when things tilted, assumed Leslie would compromise, that late-night wanton softness could smother the ember of suspicion still glowing in her. Yet the moment his hand brushed the bedside lamp to darken the room, a small device, meant to be forgotten outside the door, flared cold on its screen, a message, a photo, a clipped audio file abruptly slicing through the sealed quiet like glass newly cracked. Leslie saw the sender's name and a coded rope of letters that could speak. Language that drained the heart, words fabricated just true enough to be believed, and true enough to make pretense feel shameful. The truth might not be the truth, but a secret revealed at the right moment becomes a dagger with a handle, and the hand gripping that handle is a half of a lie waiting for its cue. Ted froze for a few seconds, then hastily killed the screen as if to shove the snake back into its basket, but Leslie had seen, had read, had already fitted the scattered fragments into a canvas full of holes yet dark enough to strangle the throat. The sensation of being tricked, belittled, replaced, used as a rest stop labeled kindness and forgiveness surged like a black tide. She thought of afternoons at Orphe Jean, those times she caught Ted bowing his head, talking too long to a slender figure, and she had waved it off, telling herself that Ted needed social oxygen to keep his position, that in this lavish, gilded city everyone performed, and the only thing she wanted was to stop being the naive spectator. But now, at the hour when night peels off the last mask, Leslie had to ask whether her faith was just another self-deception, an elegant exit hatch for those terrified of loss. Across town, Mona and Jan moved like two bullets fired at the same target on diverging paths, colliding in air thick with rancor. Mona's anger had fermented a long time, being edged out of private family dinners, the backroom agreements she heard about only in circles, the laughs behind closed doors where she suspected her name headlined decisions rubber-stamped before she could speak. Jan, by contrast, had chosen forgiveness, believing it a form of power, but the quiet she had clutched had thinned like paint on a damp wall, and finally her fury ignited when she grasped that her gentleness had been repurposed as a cover for a string of dark compromises. They stepped into a cramped chamber of memories no longer clean, and rather than cut each other loose from the web, they hauled one another farther in. Mona buried humiliation beneath surface success, while Jan smothered her sobs beneath promises traded for calm. The result was a soundless detonation, an undersea quake no one could see but that rippled every shore. Their wires to Leslie and Ted, long knotted like an old phoenix's nest, now shorted, sparked, and smoked. In a brutal tangle, private decisions slammed into each other, and the exposure of a bedroom secret for Leslie and Ted became the spark that lit Mona and Jan's stockpile of grievances. Leslie understood that the secret hadn't materialized out of nothing, someone had timed it, someone who knew exactly when to strike. She felt cornered, and when a woman like Leslie is pushed far enough back, tenderness morphs into a weapon she can't fully predict. Ted tried to tidy the scene with reason, to sort with the eyes of a crisis-seasoned man, what could save a public image, what might preserve influence, what might lull Leslie into stillness. But he miscalculated that Leslie had no use for image or influence now. She needed control over her life, proof that she wasn't a lovely pawn in a filthy power match. As he retreated, bearing the soft underbelly of his fear of confrontation, Leslie saw the blueprint he'd built, a network of relationships, a chain of bargains, all those compliant smiles, and at the center, a man who spoke of the future like a balance sheet. The pain lodged in the realization that she'd loved a schematic, not a heart. Elsewhere, Mona lunged towards something immediate. Her anger revved like a jet engine and delivered her to a harsh decision: if this world runs on secrets, she would seize the biggest one just within reach and wield it as a lever to blow open the sealed room. She loathed being the outsider, and rage drove her to conclude that destruction was the only way to force the concealment artists to kneel. Jan arrived at a different fork, quieter, but no less merciless. She watched friendship hollow out under calculations, felt her distance from Leslie stretch like a string tuned beyond pitch, and realized her kindness may have abetted someone's cover-up. Self-reproach gnawed at her will, pushing her toward a silent choice: retract forgiveness, withdraw from every brace, make those who fed on her decency breathe in the heavy air of their own design. By opposite routes, both Mona and Jan opted to fracture the cadence that had consigned them to understudy parts, and in that choice, this night became the threshold to a chain of collapses. Back with Leslie, anger condensed into resolve. She did not need to scream or shatter anything tangible, she only had to touch the bloodstream of Ted's sacred world, control. She combed through memory, checked each social junction, replayed those calls that had seemed inconsequential, those dinner tables with empty smiles, the vanishings that arrived right on cue, and she began to thread them. Once meaningless stray strands now formed a map. She glimpsed the larger game, exploiting human leaks, weaving a net of favors and dependence, tying it tight with promises and proximity. The keystone was an old name, someone supposedly set aside but still lurking, someone who could unlock the only door she had not yet forced. She suspected that very person had seeded tonight's alert. Her fury at Ted cooled into a ruthless composure. When hope evacuates the heart, the mind takes the straightest road. Leslie priced the consequences, weighed the trailing grudges that would cling like burrs to every step, and prepared to pay in ruthlessness, not tears. Meanwhile, Ted found himself trapped in the box he had sketched. He had handed power to the past to threaten the present, and now every tremor of secret could topple his moral scaffolding. He thought of reputation, rank, people who might pivot away if the story leaked, and he began to wonder whether he could still the storm with one more bargain, another pledge, or a symbolic sacrifice. But each calculation ricocheted off the wall because he had lost the critical element, Leslie's trust. Without trust, explanations read like choreography. Without trust, apologies become coins tossed into a bottomless well. In that moment Ted recognized that the fight ahead wasn't with public opinion or external rivals, it was with the person who had lain next to him, who knew his breathing best, who now saw him as a risk to be managed. In Mona's quarter, the explosion kept her sleepless. She rummaged for any proof that could crack the walls around the powerful. If she was banished to the fringe, she would push the center to the edge. Her anger, fed by small humiliations, now had a bright target. In her blindness, she did not see the cost of reprisal. Once a frightened herd stampedes, it won't distinguish attacker from bystander. Jan, meanwhile, faced her own reflection, toughness staged around a tender core. She wanted to withdraw, but a silent retreat felt like endorsing the trick played on her. So she chose a middle path, no noise, no threats, but a systematic severing of ties, declining empty invitations, ignoring calls, repaying every debt of favor by refusing to incur another. That quiet veto disoriented those around her, and the battlefield cracked not with thunder but with the faint, granular snapping of snapped trust. Before sunrise, Leslie sat on the bed's edge and studied her shoes as though they were the vehicle that could return her to solid ground. She plotted out steps that reclaimed personal jurisdiction in corners no one thought mattered: schedules, notebooks, murky expenses, pretend meetings, even access cards no one counted. She knew a single tug at the right time would make the frame shudder. She also understood that her anger could not degenerate into indiscriminate wreckage, that would make her a copy of those she despised. What she needed was an indisputable truth placed squarely on the table, forcing everyone to lower their eyes to it. In that calculus, Leslie no longer regarded Ted as a lover but as a variable to be locked down so the equation could zero out its danger. That was the most merciless instant within her, the moment she became something else, no longer the version who believed in reconciliation, but a woman willing to accept fallout to make others face their own darkness. When the sun finally slid over the city's rim, Mona held enough fragments to threaten. Jan rearranged her life with quiet finality. Ted staggered between self-preservation by sacrificial offering or clutching everything and falling free, and Leslie stood in a silent room wearing a serenity that chilled. The choices made overnight were not mere emotional reflexes, they were knives unsheathed, and no blade drawn returns to its scabbard unstained. A secret unspooled at the last hour of night, an anger aged long enough to burn steady, a friendship dissolved by compromise, and a man forced to see that he is not the universe's center. 4 people each with a private fear and an unfinished vow accidentally harmonized the prologue of a war without safe perimeters. In such a war, the victor will not be the one who shouts the loudest, but the one who can hold silence longest, keep a cool mind, and trade personal happiness for an irrefutable truth. Because once truth is set on the table, every relationship must pay its toll, and sometimes the only acceptable price is the decisive step out of a room that has been dark for far too long. And that's where the night at Fairmont Crest leaves us, a house with its lights still on, a bed that can't be slept in, and 4 people discovering that survival isn't a feeling. It's a schedule. Leslie doesn't win back control with a grand gesture, she earns it minute by minute, locking accounts, freezing narratives, insisting that the next choice be cleaner than the last. Ted enters the long winter of consequence, where apologies are invoices and every past shortcut asks for interest. Mona learns that explosive truth scatters shrapnel in every direction, including the one she's standing in, and begins the slower work of stitching credibility back together. Jan chooses maintenance over spectacle, proving that courage can be quiet and still count. From here, the negative trajectory is brutally plausible. The first public leak lands just as a board is looking for a reason to distance itself. A second leak reframes the scandal as systemic rather than personal. Editors and donors recalibrate. Whisper networks harden into consensus. Meanwhile, the so-called rescuers arrive with contracts masquerading as lifelines, offering visibility in exchange for control. Accept them and you vanish on someone else's terms, refuse them and you're accused of arrogance. That's the trap. So what matters next? Granular decisions. Who gets a key to the house? Which meetings are taken and which are starved of oxygen? Whether Leslie spends her capital on outrage or infrastructure. Whether Ted chooses retreat that looks like reflection or reflection that risks humility. Whether Mona lets bitterness become a brand or turns it into boundaries. Whether Jan keeps showing up after the headlines move on. This is where arcs are set, not by luck but by repetition. If you found this breakdown useful, hit like so this story reaches more BTG fans, subscribe for weekly deep dives, and drop your predictions below. Does Leslie consolidate or implode? Does Ted disappear or attempt a staged redemption? Does Mona leverage or recalibrate? Does Jan become the indispensable bridge? In the next video, we'll chart the power map after the fallout. Who loses leverage first, which alliances fracture quietly, and how a single synced file can redraw an entire social topography. Until then, remember, in this universe, secrets aren't buried, they're scheduled.